The midday sun bore down on the quiet suburban street, its heat shimmering off the asphalt in waves. Birds chirped lazily from the trees, and the faint hum of a lawnmower drifted from a few houses down. For Paul Grady, a retired Marine Corps veteran, it was just another day of routine. His driveway was spotless, his lawn meticulously trimmed, and his green uniform, pressed and polished, hung inside. A quiet reminder of his years of service. He wasn't expecting trouble, not today. But trouble, as it turned out, had a way of finding him. The first sign came as a dull roar in the distance, a cacophony of car horns, raised voices, and the unmistakable chant of a protest. Paul set his coffee mug down on the porch railing and stood, his sharp eyes scanning the street like they had so many times in the past, searching for threats. What he saw made his jaw tighten. A colorful sea of people spilled onto the road, carrying signs emblazoned with bold slogans. Rainbow flags waved in the air, and the chanting grew louder as they moved closer. Paul didn't have an issue with protests or with anyone expressing their beliefs. This was America, after all. But as the group stopped directly in front of his house and began setting up on his driveway, his patience quickly thinned. The leader of the group, a young man with dyed hair and a megaphone, stepped forward, rallying the protesters around him. "We're here to make a statement," he shouted, his voice amplified by the megaphone. "No more silence!" Paul's eyes narrowed as he stepped off the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel. He didn't yell or wave his arms. His presence alone was enough to command attention. Dressed in his green uniform, his medals glinting in the sunlight, Paul approached with a deliberate calm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" The chanting slowed as the group turned to face him, their confident expressions faltering slightly at the sight of the imposing figures standing before them. The leader hesitated, lowering the megaphone. "We're exercising our rights," he replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. Paul's gaze was unflinching. "Your rights don't extend to my driveway," he said firmly. "You've got 5 minutes to leave, or we're gonna have a serious problem." Paul stood firm, his green uniform pristine and gleaming under the midday sun, as the tension in the air thickened. Across from him, the group of protesters began to falter, their earlier confidence giving way to visible uncertainty. Their leader, clutching his megaphone like a lifeline, tried to rally them with forced bravado. "We're not leaving," the leader said, his voice shaking just enough to betray his nerves. "We have every right to be here." Paul didn't move, his sharp gaze fixed on the young man. "Your rights end where my property begins," he said, his tone cold and steady. "This is private property, and you're trespassing." A few of the protesters shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. One woman, her rainbow bandana fluttering in the breeze, spoke up. "We're just trying to raise awareness," she said, her tone pleading. "We didn't mean to cause trouble." Paul's jaw tightened. If you didn't want trouble, you wouldn't be standing on someone else's land, making a mess. Awareness doesn't excuse disrespect. The leader stepped closer, emboldened by the murmurs of agreement from his group. "This isn't about you or your property. This is about a bigger issue, something that matters more than your lawn." Paul's lips twitched, not quite into a smile, but into something more like a grimace of understanding. He'd heard similar arguments before, from younger men with loud voices and little understanding of the bigger picture. "You don't get to decide whose home becomes your stage," he said, his voice cutting through the group's whispers. "And you don't get to disrespect the very freedom you're protesting for." The group fell silent again, their momentum faltering under the weight of Paul's words. The leader clenched his jaw, clearly unwilling to back down. "We're not trying to disrespect anyone," he insisted. "We're trying to make a point." "You made your point when you stepped onto my property without permission," Paul snapped. "Now you're making the wrong one by staying." One of the younger protesters, his arms crossed and his sign held loosely at his side, muttered something under his breath. Paul turned his gaze on him, sharp and unyielding. "If you have something to say, say it." The young man flushed but didn't reply, his eyes darting nervously to the leader. The rest of the group began to shift more noticeably, their earlier unity cracking as Paul's authority filled the space between them. The leader, sensing he was losing control, stepped closer to Paul, his chest puffed up in a display of bravado. "What are you gonna do if we don't leave? Call the cops? Try to force us off yourself?" Paul's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. If you stay, you'll deal with the consequences. That's not a threat, that's a fact. The tension escalated. A few protesters whispered among themselves, their confidence visibly waning. The woman with the bandana tugged at the leader's arm, her voice barely audible. "Maybe we should just go," she said. "This isn't worth it." But the leader shook her off, his pride refusing to let him back down. "No," he said firmly, raising his megaphone again. "We're not—" Before he could finish, Paul took a deliberate step forward, his presence alone enough to silence him. "You've got 30 seconds, Paul said, his voice sharper than a command on the battlefield. "Leave now, or I'll make the call." The leader hesitated, glancing back at his group. Their uncertain expressions said it all. They didn't want to stay. The murmurs grew louder, and one by one, the protesters began to retreat, their earlier fire reduced to smoldering embers. Paul didn't move, his posture unwavering as the group gathered their things and began to shuffle away. The leader lingered, glaring at Paul as though trying to regain some measure of control. "This isn't over," he muttered. Paul's eyes didn't waver. "It is if you're smart," he replied. The leader didn't respond. He turned and followed the others, leaving Paul alone in the quiet aftermath. As the distant murmurs of their retreat faded, Paul stood on his driveway, his boots rooted firmly in place. He exhaled slowly, but his mind remained sharp, already preparing for what might come next. Paul lingered in his driveway, his boots rooted firmly to the ground, as the last of the protesters disappeared down the street. The air was still thick with the tension of the confrontation, but he felt a growing sense of calm settling over him. The sunlight glinted off the medals on his green uniform as he bent down to gather the trash and discarded signs strewn across his lawn. Each movement was deliberate, his expression unreadable. As he tossed the remnants into the bin, Paul's mind replayed the events. The shouting, the defiance, the leader's stubbornness. All of it felt familiar, like echoes from his days in the service. But this wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't enemies. They were kids, idealistic, headstrong, and blind to the reality of their actions. What angered him wasn't their cause. It was their disregard for respect, for boundaries. To Paul, those principles were sacred, forged in fire and sacrifice. Inside, Paul poured himself a fresh glass of iced tea and sank into his chair by the window. His muscles ached, a reminder of his age and the intensity of the confrontation. But his resolve remained firm. The neighborhood outside had returned to its usual rhythm. A couple of kids rode their bikes down the street, and the hum of a lawnmower drifted through the open window. Peace had returned, for now. The following morning, as Paul sipped his coffee on the porch, a hesitant knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he was surprised to see the woman with the rainbow bandana standing there, her head bowed slightly and her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir," she said, her voice quiet but earnest. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. We didn't mean to disrespect you or your home. I guess we got carried away." Paul studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "It takes guts to admit when you're wrong," he said. "I appreciate that." The woman nodded, her relief palpable. "We just wanted to make a difference, but I see now that we went about it the wrong way. You were right. Respect matters." Paul gestured for her to sit on the porch, and they talked for a while. He shared stories from his time in the service, tales of camaraderie and sacrifice that had taught him the value of discipline and understanding. She listened intently, her perspective shifting with every word. As she left, she turned back and said, "Thank you for everything." Paul nodded, watching her walk down the driveway and out of sight. Her apology had been unexpected but welcome. It reminded him that even the most heated confrontations could lead to understanding if both sides were willing to listen. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood remained quiet. The protesters didn't return, and the sense of normalcy settled in like a comforting blanket. Paul resumed his routine, mowing the lawn, fixing things around the house, and enjoying the simplicity of retirement. But the memory of that day stayed with him, not as a source of frustration, but as a lesson. The incident had reminded him that standing his ground wasn't just about defending his property. It was about upholding the values he'd spent his life living by. Respect, boundaries, and the willingness to confront wrongs. Those were the principles that had guided him through war and into the peaceful life he had built. One afternoon, as Paul sat on his porch, a group of kids rode by on their bikes. One of them stopped and waved. "Thanks for keeping our neighborhood safe, Mr. Grady," the boy said before pedaling off. Paul smiled faintly, lifting his glass of iced tea in acknowledgement. He hadn't set out to be a hero or a neighborhood protector, but he was proud to have made a difference, however small. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting warm light across his yard, Paul leaned back in his chair, content with the quiet that surrounded him. For Paul, the confrontation had been more than a clash of wills. It was a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing firm, even when it was uncomfortable. And in the end, that was a legacy worth leaving behind.